Moving forward, we're now on item 6D. Discussion and possible action, including directing County Counsel and the Planning and Building Services Director to determine the feasibility of using satellite imagery to demilitarize cannabis code enforcement and collect fees and/or taxes from the non-permitted cultivation. Supervisor Williams, you're the sponsor. Please introduce the item, sir.
I can see two use cases where satellite images may be beneficial. One is to get a count of current cultivation. I've heard numbers as high as 9,000, and I see there's less than a few hundred in the license system, and we're about to close the door to most of those cultivators with phase one coming to an end in the coming days. I think without using a contractor to get an analysis, a total count, without the county accepting any personal details, would give us a number to work against to see how that progress bar has moved. Are we at 3%? Are we at 5%? And hopefully that would catalyze some next steps. We have a problem. The elephant in the room is we have thousands of cultivation sites. We're closing the door for them to come into compliance. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I can see satellite imagery being useful for bringing those unlicensed cultivation sites into compliance. The strategy to date has been to have applicants work through a process and then get a license. I'm suggesting if somebody builds a house in this county without a permit and it's discovered, the remedy is not to bulldoze the house and tell them they can't build another house. It's to tell them they need to pay the fees with some fines, and if there are code violations, remedy those code violations over a reasonable period of time. I would suggest the same for cannabis, that if we find thousands of sites that are not participating, the abatement letter, the satellite imagery would generate an abatement letter. The abatement letter would need to include an opt-in to become part of the license program immediately, at which time we would give a reasonable window of time. Maybe it's 3 to 5 years to come into compliance. If we don't do something here, we're forcing people to remain in the black market without any possibility of coming into the regulated market, which means the county loses significant revenue. So I've heard numbers as high as 9,000. If there are really 9,000 sites, say even at the 2,500 minimum tax tier, that's $22 million of revenue that we're losing. And we're putting people in a position when they see that National Guard fly over, they're unlicensed, they're operating illegally. I think we're aware the sheriff is not focused on these backyard grows. He's focused on really egregious environmental concerns. But even so, we have thousands of people who fear when that helicopter comes over because they are illegal and they believe they can't move into the legal system, especially with phase one ending.
Okay, Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, in contrast to previous occasions when I've disagreed with everything except the motion, I agree with quite a bit of what Supervisor Williams has said. But this is really a measure, I see it, to streamline code enforcement and to hold people accountable. We are not forcing anyone into the black market. It's a choice that people make if they are still growing without a permit or a permit application. I think we've had about 1,200 applications in total. We have been accepting permit applications for 2.5 years. So people who are still growing outside of the permit process are doing so by a choice that they're making. And at some point, if we're serious about having a legal regulated market, we have to do something about the people who are not choosing to participate in the legal regulated market. This potentially is an efficient way of doing that. We've all seen the stories out of Humboldt County where they do use aerial imagery. They send enforcement letters. If people dispute the findings in the letter, they can come forward. In one case, a greenhouse was being used to grow vegetables, I think. So that can all be sorted out. But somehow the message needs to go out. You're either in the legal system or you're not allowed to grow cannabis commercially. And I agree, the sheriff, the primary focus of the sheriff is on those egregious violators that are harming the environment. And even there, the sheriff can only get a fraction. So I don't have a concern about what the total number of people out there is. My concern is if they're cultivating outside of the permit process and beyond their exemption limits for either personal or medical use, they should be held accountable. And that's the number one way you're going to help sustain the legal market. One more comment, though. I do object to the term demilitarize. We don't have militarized code enforcement in Mendocino County. We have men and women going out with clipboards and cameras, and that's code enforcement. Law enforcement, when they are conducting eradication, they have to be prepared for whatever situation they may encounter. But let's have a separation between law enforcement activity and code enforcement activity.
Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, I'd like to add that this item is really about directing the planning director and county council to look at the feasibility. It's not for any particular plan of action. It's just to get some cost estimates, find out what's possible, bring that back to us. I see this, it would need to be in concert with other changes, maybe changes to our ordinance. It may be that we need to go to the state and lobby based on our findings. If we find there are 9,000 sites, I think it's time to have a discussion with the state. We have a problem, the way the Prop 64 implementation has been rolled out. We have not been able to bring the majority of cultivators into the legal market. Maybe we've only brought 5% in. That's a failure. This board's worked very hard. The county staff has worked incredibly hard. But if at the end of the process, we only have 5 or even 10% of the cultivators in the legal system, where the county's falling short on revenue, and that's, you know, it's hitting us in every direction of services, and we're not giving legitimacy to these cultivators. A lot of them want to be part of the legal market, and they're scared because they've seen their neighbors try to go through it, and it's a very difficult process. I mean, the planning director, I think, hope he doesn't mind if I quote him, but he said our ordinance is very difficult, one of the more challenging ordinances he's worked with. No fault here, but something needs to be done to shift this equation so that we can have a success of most cultivation being legal. In the years to come, the policy we set should have an eye years out, not just tomorrow, but 3, 5, 10 years out. With the national market opening, it'll be more important for cultivators in our county to be part of the legal system. Today, they might be black market selling out of state. That may not always be a viable business model. And I worry that by closing phase 1 and telling them, well, you had 2 years to get in the system, you didn't do it, you're permanently shut out, it's a large economic hit to the county that'll trickle down everywhere, even businesses outside of cannabis.
Okay, we're going to go to public comment. Public comment on this item. Anyone that would like to speak, please come forward.
Ron Edwards Willits. I heard a very interesting thing mentioned, that we'd use this Imagery and they would get a letter and they would have the ability to opt in. So are we saying that this letter now will give you an opportunity to get in? Because I would think that the reason that they're not in is because of some zoning issue, some other reason. So are we saying that, hey, if we go with this, you'll get this letter and you just can get in the program? I don't think that's very reasonable. The other side of this is cost. Again, we are going to be looking at $250,000 a year to contract with plant.com, and then we're going to need staff that's going to need to do that. So again, the cannabis program is in the hole. We only have less than 300 people. We're closing, and quite frankly, there is chaos right now about people not really understanding what this closing means. It's just really clear we need working groups. I mean, staff does a great job of understanding it, but I don't see staff foresaw the situation of, whoa, what about future expansion after this phase closes? Also, our ordinance through the whole time was a complaint-driven ordinance. Enforcement was complaint-driven. This is not complaint-driven. This is going out. I understand not everybody's in the program, but I think it's a failure of getting people into the program. And I don't know if it's the ordinance. I know that it's very complicated. I would rather see the ordinance reworked to get more people into the program to try to do this again and have input from the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Scott Ward, Road to Valley. Thank you for your time, everybody. I'm going to be a little bit redundant with Ron. He stole my thunder. I did code enforcement for the county for 13 years when I worked here, and the culture then was, it was complaint driven. We did not go out and seek problems and look for it. We just caught more grief. It gave us more work than we had staff for. So while I understand Supervisor Williams' desires to bring the non-compliant into the fold, there's a lot of barriers with the way the ordinance is written. I helped a friend just submit an application last week so he could beat the deadline. And I'd forgotten what a brutal experience that is to put all that paperwork together. I mean, it's a packet that thick, you know, half a dozen state agencies and applications. It's technically challenging, and that's what I did for a living for 30 years. So I think that if you're going to do this, you're going to be changing the culture of code enforcement, and it needs to be sold to the public, because all of a sudden the perception's already not well. You guys aren't very well perceived anyway in the cannabis community because of the onerous parts of the ordinance, and to have satellite images, it's like an example of Big Brother. Whether it's true or not, perceptions are everybody's reality. I think the money could be spent better. If we have that kind of money, I think it'd be spent better on staff right now to get us over the hump and get us into the next phase and get it streamlined before we consider something like that. Let's get it going and get everybody we can in by making the system better, have it staffed up. And it doesn't do anything about militarization. That's the sheriff's job and the state's job and Camp's job and the governor's call with the National Guard. It just has, to me, it has a Big Brother feel to it. I agree with Supervisor McCowan. They've had a couple of years to get in. They should have gotten in. But for some, it's just too hard to get in and too expensive. Thank you.
Casey?
Good morning. Casey O'Neill, local farmer, policy chair for Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. We respectfully oppose this idea. I think this is a classic example of how regulatory creep occurs. We take a populace that doesn't have the ability to stand up for itself, single them out for a new form of surveillance, and then that becomes broader and broader and broader. You know, I think a lot of people live in Mendocino County for a reason, and the idea that the eye in the sky is going to be keeping an eye on you on private property is something that is, this is a drastic and dramatic shift for our county, and I don't think it's the appropriate methodology. I can understand where you're coming from, Supervisor, in terms of the desire for data. You know, I would suggest perhaps reaching out to DFW. I think they've done a count already. I'm very concerned about the idea of code enforcement, as has been stated by previous speakers, becoming proactive rather than complaint-driven. I think that is also a dramatic shift in policy. And I think it's really important to note that enforcement without opportunity is a broken paradigm. And, you know, Supervisor McCowan, I don't think it's quite so much a choice for a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people who come to me to ask what they should do. Should they do this? How should they do this? And for a lot of people, you know, I say, well, do you want to be a business owner in a highly regulated, complex, and changing environment that costs a lot of money? And for a lot of people, it's not so much a choice. It's a choice they would love to make, but don't have either the abilities or the money to make that choice. And so I think we need to be very, very careful when how we approach this issue. And I think it's very important that we realize a number of factors in terms of, you know, federal prohibition still is existing, so there is a supply and demand, and if we move in this route with this policy, what's going to happen is it's going to push people back under the trees. And the environmental ramifications are arguably much more damaging for widespread large-scale cultivation under the trees than small-scale cultivation, 25 plants in a sun-grown patch. And so, you know, in the old days, like I've seen some of the old sites, you know, 1,000 plants, rat poison everywhere. Like there's some bad things that happen under the trees. And I think that there was a really positive movement in it coming forward into the sun and being, you know, right next to the homestead, 25 plants. And so I think that we need to be very, very careful about how we approach this issue. And I do not think it is the appropriate route for us to go to start looking at satellite surveillance. Thank you.
Jed?
Jed Davis, Potter Valley. Thank you. I'd like to just agree with what Casey's saying. Our goals are to bring everybody into compliance. I hate to see a lot of the people that can't or haven't gotten into the program not come into compliance and basically be wiped out. I just wrote a piece for the Mendocino Environmental Center about the status of the small grower, and the way compliance has been shaped, it's really the well-funded corporate actors that are able to go through this period of time of uncertainty, complexity, and expense. I feel like where the initial problem happened was the state came and overhauled a system that was already pretty much working. There's hundreds of thousands of people making thousands of dollars of living. And then we came in with the ordinance that's really difficult and it's expensive. I'm a pretty cerebral person and I pull my hair out trying to get through this. And the goalpost is always moving. And I feel like we, as a government, state and county, need to realize that we overdid it, we didn't do it right. The barrier to entry is expensive and extremely difficult. And if we can wipe that out, allow people to just come in and start paying a tax or pay a license fee, continue growing, get your seller's permit, get your state permit, and that way they're paying taxes, and then say, we're gonna start testing you. That's the first key, is we wanna know you're growing safe stuff and it's going to proper outlets. Then give a 3, 5, 7-year amnesty period to allow these businesses to come into full business compliance. When you gotta spend $600 to take a 30-hour OSHA training for 2 employees, yeah, I mean, it just goes on and on. $2,500 a year for the water board, $1,200 application fee for an application renewal. Why am I resubmitting a whole packet and paying $1,200 for a renewal fee right now? It doesn't make any sense. And so people aren't coming into the program for that reason. Make it easy, let them come in, give them time to make some money and slowly become compliant. Then we'll have everybody in the program and paying taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else, public comment on this item? Seeing no one come forward, it is back to the board. Supervisor McCowan and then Supervisor Jurdy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we've heard a lot of comments about how difficult it is to come into compliance. And I do believe most of those difficulties were created by the state and Prop 64. So that combination, and Prop 64, voter approved, can only be changed substantively by the voters. The mandates the state has laid down can only be changed by the state legislature. We have a number of items in our legislative platform that are intended to remove some of the burdens that are created by the state. But if the Mendocino County ordinance is difficult, it's because it has attempted to accurately capture the things that have to be done to satisfy the state. The call to just let everyone in, and that's actually kind of where I started with this when we knew that state legalization was coming. I think this board, those of us who were here initially, were very much of the mind, let's create a legal regulatory system. Let's bring existing growers into that system. And by simply doing that, we're going to improve the environmental impacts by getting people in a regulated legal system where we have people inspecting their activities, making recommendations for improvement, That would have allowed virtually anyone who sincerely wanted to come in and get legal to do so. The tragedy of how this is all rolled out, there are many, many, many people who advocated for legalization and regulation, who wanted to step forward, get a permit, pay their taxes and all the rest, aren't able to do so because primarily the state has made it so difficult. Most of the complexities in our ordinance are there to try and benefit discrete categories of growers with unique situations to be able to allow them to participate and get legal. If we stripped out all of those variations in the ordinance, it'd be more simpler and straightforward. Even fewer people would qualify. But so where we are now, we have to face the reality that at the state level, the ordinance is what it is. We can't simply say, come on down, submit your permit, we'll let you in. We don't have that authority to unilaterally do that. It doesn't help people if we approve at the county level a permit that will be rejected at the state level. I also think that turning a blind eye to people that are blatantly growing outside of the legal permitted system is an unfair business practice that undercuts the legal market, that undercuts those of you who have been attempting to become legal and participate in the legal regulated market. You're facing unfair competition. This isn't going to happen overnight if we do move forward with this, and I do think it's a reasonable direction to give to the department to investigate. Streamlining code enforcement is how I look at this, to bring people into compliance. I think going along with that, it's a valid point that if we're going to do this, we should also, in keeping with Supervisor Williams' suggestion that people have the option to opt in, we probably should, if we're going to move forward with this, open another window of opportunity where people do have the opportunity to come forward, whether they've gotten that letter or not. You know, so I could see us reopening that period, and I think that would be equitable. That would give everybody plenty of advance notice. Okay, we know you didn't come forward yet for whatever reason. You're going to have another opportunity. So I would support the motion, except I would strike the word demilitarize and say streamline.
Supervisor Jordy.
Well, I think on the face of it, it'd be hard to argue with this proposed motion. I mean, most people would say they would support it. However, code enforcement, which is not only about cannabis, it's about many, many things, is a county service that I would say is pretty popular in my district. And I think that people in my community are happy with the fact that we've increased code enforcement from 3 to 6 code enforcement officers. We've added a county counsel attorney to work with code enforcement. And I am concerned with adding a bunch of new caseload to the code enforcement division with this proactive search. I believe that the worst of the code enforcement violations are reported by members of the public. And I'm concerned with issues that the members of the public are bringing to the county might not be dealt with because they get inundated with the satellite imagery of all these locations to go to. So I'm concerned about how that could disrupt the code enforcement activities of the county. So I think if we give any direction to staff, I'd like us to hear back from code enforcement specifically about how it could disrupt their workload, and would they have code enforcement complaints that they would not be able to address in a timely manner, because I don't want to see that happen.
Supervisor Haschak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we're all wanting everyone to come into compliance, and that's certainly a goal that we've all had. It's just, how do we go about doing that? And what's the big picture in making that happen? And with that goal in mind, I don't see that this agenda item is the right approach. You know, I think there's certainly issues with civil liberties. There's the cost factor. There's the workload factor. It's shifting away from that complaint basis. I just, I think if we want to achieve our goal of getting everyone on board, getting everyone into the system, which is a worthy goal, I don't think this is it. So I'm going to vote, well, we don't have a motion on the floor, so,
It's okay.
so anyway.
Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, if I could respond to supervisors and some of the public comment. I fully agree with Supervisor McCowan, including the language change. I agree with the speakers Jed Davis and Casey O'Neill. We don't want Big Brother using satellite surveillance, but I see that we have a problem at hand. The issue here is the implementation of Prop 64. We're not going to solve it no matter what we do with our ordinance. There are inherent problems stemming from the state. And it's hard for us to go to the state and say, we have this problem. We have lots of growers who have not come into the program because they can't. We need to distill that to some credible data. We need to be able to say we have 8,535 cultivators, and this is why they can't come into the program. It's not that they're not willing or that they don't want to pay taxes, but they just simply can't do it. So if we could compromise, this item was just feasibility anyway, but if we could compromise and focus it not on enforcement, but deriving that total count, getting a contractor, so it's no workload for us, getting a contractor to figure out what is the count, how many gardens do we have, so we could compare that against how many are licensed without divulging any property addresses or parcel numbers. I think that would be a huge step in the direction of working with the state. Without that, it's very difficult. We have this vague sense of, well, we know there's a lot of grows that are not participating.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, my concerns about fiscal responsibility are heightened with those last comments, because if this is only data collection and we're asking staff to, first we have to pay for the program, and then we have to have our staff analyzing all this data with no way to pay for it unless we make an additional general fund allocation. The action, as originally stated, is very simple. It says simply determine the feasibility, and we know that the program would cost money, but we also know that it's very predictable that it would generate revenue that would greatly exceed the cost of the program. So that's how you pay for it. And this wouldn't result in suddenly staff has to jump in the car and drive up Minor Road. It would result in staff generating a letter if the satellite imagery indicates, yep, looks like cultivation, they're not in the permitting program. So it makes better, more effective, efficient use of staff time, something we've identified as a need going forward. Also, the cannabis program is not currently in the hole despite popular belief. We've been reviewing the numbers, and the combination of permit fees and taxes has generated a significant positive to the general fund. So it's not costing money, but that's for another day. I hope to have those refined numbers come forward for board discussion. But this program, if it were implemented, pays for itself and then some. So I do support the original motion. And the difference between standard code enforcement, it's something that, it's an activity that somebody's doing at some times but not others. It's building code violations that may have occurred within the house. It's not as simple as the plants are there or the plants are not there. And we're constantly told that our general government staff across the hall are reviewing building code or reviewing imagery to see, did somebody build a structure without a permit. Anyway, I like the item as presented. Simply research the feasibility and come back. I might put a 45 or 60 days on it.
Supervisor Haschuk?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think one of the speakers said that we might get more information from checking with CDFW, and they probably have lots of information about what's going on out there that wouldn't cost us. I worry about spending a lot of money on this eye in the sky and having people, instead of growing out in the sunshine, going into hoop houses, going into, greenhouses where, you're creating a lot of plastic garbage waste, and people going back into hiding because of this maneuver. I just don't support it at this point.
Supervisor Williams.
Give me 1 second.
Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if we could ask the director if he foresees what kind of burden he would see on his department if they implement the original motion and review the feasibility of implementing this type of program. Is that something that would be an unreasonable burden on his staff? Or does he see benefits of moving forward with this?
Madam Chair, could I address the board? Brent Schultz, Planning and Building Services Director. I don't see a burden on the staff just analyzing this and talking more to Humboldt or the other jurisdictions that are using this satellite imagery for code enforcement and to deal with the issues that happen in rural counties like Humboldt and like we're seeing. And I don't think that'd be a problem analyzing, coming back with some recommendations on could it work for us? Does it not? So I don't really see any problem with it.
Okay. Supervisor Williams.
Simply sending abatement letters telling cultivators to stop cultivating won't generate any revenue from the county. That would actually be a cost. So that's why I started with this would need to be in concert with something like phase 1, either reopening the door or having a phase 1.5. Because if all we do is shut people down, that's a cost to the county, it's a cost to the local economy, it's not helping the cultivators. Maybe Supervisor McCowan has some ideas about when we find there are violations, people who are growing unpermitted, how would we bring them into compliance rather than shut them down?
Supervisor McCowan, do you want to respond, sir?
Well, yes, Madam Chair. I think the letter could simply say, based on information that we have, we believe you're cultivating outside of the permitted program in violation of exempt amounts. You either need to cease immediately or, there is a fine structure that would be imposed, or submit an application. And if people either cease the activity or they submit an application, there wouldn't be fines. If they persist, they would. And maybe give them, you have 2 weeks to submit your application. I mean, people know what's going on out there. They know they have a choice to either get permitted or not. For a lot of reasons, including the hope they can just keep doing what they've been doing, people haven't been coming forward. This would both be the carrot and the stick that we're actually serious. Now is the time. You will either apply for a permit or cease the activity, or there will be consequences. I think it's pretty simple.
Is it, and this is not a rhetorical question, is it simple with phase 1 closing? Can the majority of the people who are not currently permitted, can they come in under phase 3?
I believe we've had discussion about reopening, but that would be a future decision the board would make when the feasibility report comes back. And I would assume with that would be options for the board to consider. Either A, it's not feasible, let's junk it, or it could be, we believe it's feasible, here's how you could implement it, and then potential policy decisions based on board discussion. We would have the option to have a new window of opportunity for people to apply. I think that's inherent in the comments several of us have made.
Okay, Supervisor Jurdy.
So this raises another concern, because I think the only way this would work would be if we reopened phase one for the people getting letters. And my concern is, what would be the impact on the planning department and the building department if they're inundated with several hundred applicants who did not come into phase one originally and now are coming in due to the letters, and at the same time the county is moving ahead with phase three? Would this disrupt our ability to take in new applicants on land that we've identified as appropriately zoned for phase three, and bringing in what could be significant revenue to the county? We might be better off going ahead, implementing phase three, bringing in some real revenue to the county general fund, and then 2-3 years down the road, looking at this kind of a program, a reopener of phase one.
Okay, we need
I mean,
to get to a conclusion. Supervisor Williams?
I agree with those comments, but my worry is if we don't really have 90% of cultivators outside of the legal market today, I don't know if we can wait a few years. But I say if because we don't have a total count, so it's really hard to say. Is it half? Is it 90%? I have no idea. I move we direct County Counsel and Planning and Building Services Director to determine the feasibility of using satellite imagery to streamline cannabis code enforcement, collect fees and/or taxes from non-permitted cultivation, and based on findings, consider reopening phase one if necessary to bring cultivators into compliance.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comment to the motion?
Just that I might feel different about this motion in 2 or 3 years from now.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to emphasize this motion does not commit the board to any particular course of action. It simply is directed to bring us the information needed to make decisions about future action. So, and we've heard from the director, it's not a burden to his staff to do so. I hope we could support it.
But it's going to be coming back as an item.
Absolutely. Oh, and did we want to put a timeline on it and, maybe 60 days? Would that be reasonable?
Do you
I'd
wanna-
support that.
You want to?
Can we amend the motion and planning director to bring back findings within 60 days?
Agree.
Okay, so the motion has been amended. The second has agreed. Any other comment? Let's vote by the button.
The motion carries with Supervisors Hashchak and Jurdy dissenting.
All righty.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I just wanted to confirm that feasibility will also include a fiscal analysis to return to the board as well.
I think that was one of my comments, the cost. Okay.